Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
This is the sixth and final episode in our latest mini-series, a deep dive into fine-tuning of the universe. What was going to be a single episode that would not get into the fine-tuning for life became a 6-episode mini-series with the central unifying theme of fine-tuning that ultimately leads to the spontaneous appearance of life. This will be the last episode of that mini-series, and as it turns out, for this season of episodes, Season 5, it will be the last one in which we bring in a guest expert. The fall always gets very busy for me, mainly because of teaching 2 undergrad courses at the university, plus other personal distractions. So it's time once again for us to go on hiatus. Next week, Scott and I will take a final look back at Season 5, say a few things about some of the highlights and the major takeaways, and tie a bow on it. More on that later. But first, let's set the stage for today's discussion. Having heard from 5 scholars about the Big Bang producing a universe full of atomic elements that were nudged along by physical laws and chemical properties built into them, coerced to self-assemble into stars and planets, complex macromolecules, and eventually the first life forms, today we're going to talk to another scholar about the biochemical mechanisms and evolutionary driving forces that turned those primitive organisms into ever more complex plants and animals. Dr. Simon Conway Morris did his PhD studies at Cambridge University and then spent a good bit of his scientific research career studying the Burgess Shale, which is a rock formation in the Canadian Rockies of British Columbia, full of fossils from the Cambrian period. These are the oldest soft body imprints, not bone or skeleton fossils, but fossils of the actual soft bodies of the earliest life forms on Earth 500 million years ago. Dr. Conway Morris has been the chair of evolutionary paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Cambridge since 1995 and is now an emeritus professor. And we have him here in our studio. Dr. Conway Morris, welcome.
Thank you very much.
We're so happy to bring you and your expertise into this conversation.
Yeah, no, I great opportunity. I will mention, Doctor, that I have read a number of your books. Not all of them cover to cover. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a layperson. I'm not a biologist, so I have to read slowly, but really appreciate your work.
Oh, thank you so much.
Simon, you're a very prolific writer. There's not many who can claim a CV like yours. You put your name on the scientific map when it came to your innumerable scientific papers. You essentially wrote the book on the Cambrian explosion and the Burgess Shale, and Stephen Jay Gould often quoted you and referred to you on that. And then there's your many books written both at the general level and books for scholars. I'd like to call attention to 2 of them in particular because they're directly related to our topic today. The Runes of Evolution, How the Universe Became Self-Aware. I like that title, The Runes. It's not ruins, but runes. Runes being symbols or letters of an ancient alphabet. I like to play on words there.
Precisely.
And your most recent book, From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, 6 Myths of Evolution. We're going to take a look at a few of those myths in the second half of this episode.
Well, thank you. But I should say in parenthesis, a couple of those are ones which are, if you like, my sole authorship. Other ones I've simply contributed to. So your listeners should not any way imagine that they're all my own work, as we say.
Simon, we've heard from our previous guests over the past few weeks about how it looks like the universe was finely tuned to produce life, and even intelligent life. And that life was just poised and waiting, ready to get on the stage as soon as the curtains were pulled apart. And once they did, life just took off running. It took 10 billion years for the Earth itself to form, but only 500 million years after that for life on Earth to begin to leave fossil evidence in the rock layers. And then the race for biological complexity began. I'd like to give the audience a familiar analogy to help them get a sense of how quickly this evolution accelerated. If you scaled that race down to a 24-hour period, it's like Earth coming into existence at midnight, the first fossils of life appearing in the wee hours of the morning, the first multicellular life forms at dinner time, the first fish, land plants, and amphibians by 10 p.m., the dinosaurs by 10:30, birds and mammals by 11:30 at night, and then humans at midnight. So Simon, give us a few thoughts on that rapid pace, that exponential pace of emergence of complexity, and how it's almost like that complexity was already baked in, just waiting to be unfurled like a flag.
Well, that's a whole set of very complex ideas to try and crystallize. I mean, just in parenthesis, the evidence suggests that the Earth formed as part of the solar system about 4.5 billion years ago. And indeed, what appear to be reliable fossils are perhaps available from about 3.5 billion years ago. So that's maybe a billion years after the Earth itself actually formed. Excuse me. But thereafter, actually, in a certain way, but all of this is subject to change. It was a relatively slow process so far as we can tell, in as much as the bulk of time, which you just referred to in a 24-hour clock, is effectively microbial. Now, actually, very, very recently, a paper I saw in passing suggests that complex life, which might be related to the animals, appeared somewhat earlier than we thought. But the fact of the matter is that to the first approximation, more complex forms really only begin to appear from around about 600 billion years ago. So in a sense, that's slightly later than some people have imagined. But one's always got to remind oneself, we're dealing with the science, we're always dealing with things which may yet be overturned. In fact, it's more than likely that new evidence will come available. And thereafter, we have, first of all, an interval before the Cambrian itself, which includes the so-called Ediacaran period. And it's my general consensus that the fossils there, which are abundant and have a global distribution and are indeed effectively soft-bodied, those are difficult to understand, but they are most likely early animals. Thereafter, when we go into the Cambrian explosion, the reason it became obvious to people like Darwin and others back in the 19th century, of course, is that skeletons first appeared in abundance in the fossil record, almost out of nowhere. But we now know from deposits such as the Burgess Shale and similar deposits in places in China and Greenland and Australia, that in point of fact, the number of species with skeletons was only a small fraction of the total biota. And indeed, most of the biota lacked skeletons, or at least were not sufficiently robust to fossilize in normal circumstances. So the wonderful thing about the Burgess Shale, of course, is it gives you a window into early animal life. So that's really, if you like, the first key point to make.
So I'm just curious, since we're on the topic of the Cambrian explosion, that is, the Cambrian explosion is used quite a bit by, for example, the intelligent design movement to make an argument for this idea that there must have been some intervention, right, for this all of a sudden to come about and so on. So I'm just curious what you would have to say to that.
Well, quite bluntly, I wouldn't have anything to say to about it at all. I mean, my views on intelligent design are almost unprincipled, frankly. I'm sorry if that offends anybody. And probably
You're not an advocate, I gather.
I'm not, indeed. No, absolutely. And the fact of the matter is that from the perspective of evolution, simply in terms of how we understand evolutionary processes, there's absolutely no need to invoke the sorts of things which the intelligent design people would wish to introduce. It's as simple as that. Right. With regard to the Cambrian explosion, I mean, it depends what you mean by abrupt, but obviously if you have a facilitation, and earlier in the history of the Earth, for example, the rise in atmospheric oxygen may well have facilitated things which prior to that were not possible. And correspondingly, I believe, that I'm not an expert on this, there were very dramatic changes in the nature of the ocean chemistry at around about the time of the Cambrian explosion. So if that ocean chemistry facilitates the rise of animals, therefore we will have an explosion.
Right.
Now, you can always ask, why does the ocean evolve in a certain way? But that's a scientific question.
Right.
So would that abruptness of the appearance of some of the life forms in the Cambrian, part of that would have to do, I'm thinking, with how fossilization, the process, is very fickle. And it's not surprising that you don't have all the different steps in the ladder to different organisms.
Any paleontologist, like any scientist, always knows they're dealing with incomplete data. The only thing we can establish beyond reasonable doubt is we know a great deal more about the fossil record today than we did even 40 years ago. And as a consequence, with the fact that by and large, what we discover on a day-to-day basis simply confirms what we're already seeing, it is something which, is entirely to be expected. And I think it was J.B.S. Haldane was once asked what would happen if somebody discovered the remains of a rabbit in the Ordovician. That's just after the Cambrian. In other words, there weren't even any land animals at that stage. And he said, I hope I don't misquote him, he'd say, well, my faith in evolution would be very much shaken. So yes, indeed. I mean, if one was to find, a fossil bird in the Silurian, it's not impossible. One could imagine it happening, but you'd have to telescope an awful lot of evolutionary history to permit that to be, in any sense, believable. And then, parenthesis, I'm very interested in the early evolution of the birds. That's fine and large. And some very interesting tracks were found in South America, which seem to suggest that the appearance of the birds was substantially earlier than had generally been thought. Not dramatically so, but substantially. But it turned out, in fact, the sediments in which, in fact, these footprints were preserved were incorrectly dated. It's as simple as that. The dates were wrong. And so, as again, in a scientific way, occasionally, and this is a simple and honest error, it's nothing sinister about this, then indeed you have to keep your mind open that just suppose the Ordovician rabbit pops out of the conjurer's hat. But by and large, every fossil you find in a particular layer of sediment is pretty well guaranteed to be what you would expect.
Yeah, this I know that in Richard Dawkins' book, I think it's in the God Delusion. He says often people will say, "Well, evolution is not falsifiable." He makes the same argument. He says it's very falsifiable. Simply find me a fossil in the wrong strata, and there you go. And yet within certain circles, particularly Christian religious circles, that idea is still very prevalent.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, broadly in evolution, there's a sort of debate between, if you like, models of explosive diversification. But these are not weekend events. They're still taking millions of years. And people describe the sort of contrast between what they call short fuse and long fuse. So in the case of the Cambrian explosion, it may well be the fuse was, if you like, ignited hundreds of millions of years before we actually see the explosion. So things are ticking along very nicely indeed. Thank you very much. But if it's dependent on fossils which are only seldom preserved, then of course we're dealing once again with incomplete information. But no scientist loses any sleep on that. Otherwise, we would be out of a job.
Yeah.
So I laid out that timeline to make the point that the evolution of life on Earth was very rapid, relatively speaking. It was very soon after Earth formed that you suddenly had evidence of life on Earth to the extent that it left fossilized evidence. I thought it was 500 million. You said more, perhaps more like 1 billion, but I still feel that that's very rapid after the 10 billion years it took to put the planet in place, and then all of a sudden, 500 million or 1 billion years later, you've got life covering the Earth. I thought it's suggestive of something.
Well, I have to correct you. I'm sorry. I mean, it's not 10 billion years. I mean, we know beyond reasonable doubt that the solar system itself forms at about 4.5 billion years. And we know that with some confidence that the Earth was probably habitable by 4 billion years ago in terms of surface temperatures, maybe earlier. That's all up for debate. And corresponding, the first really convincing fossils are around about 3.5 billion years. So they're a billion years later. There are, however, all sorts of possibilities. First of all, of course, the vast majority of those very early rocks have been heated and stretched. And as we say in the trade, they are metamorphic. And therefore, there are rather few pristine rocks of that age. Most rocks on the Earth's surface are continually recycled in plate tectonics and mountain building and all the rest of it. So the number of well-preserved, pristine sediments which go back that far are very few and far between, and only from one or two places in the world. Okay, so you've got to remember that. Another possibility, which of course is yet to be examined in detail, is in point of fact, the life didn't start on this planet at all. It may well have started on Mars, and there are various reasons to think Mars was actually at that stage in its history more benign than the Earth was for various reasons, which we don't have to go into in any detail. And we have Martian meteorites, which are being found in considerable numbers on this planet. And therefore, one can sort of make the suggestion that early in the history of the solar system, meteorites with living cells on them were blasted off the surface of Mars and were then fell to the Earth. And they by, if you like, fertilized the Earth. Again, this is science. This is a hypothesis. It's something which, as the new work continues in Mars, we should, I imagine, within 10 years perhaps, have a much better idea whether in fact there was any evidence of life on Mars. There's no evidence, to my way of thinking, of existing life on Mars. Yeah, so there we are, and the point is that we don't know very much about the origin of life. I certainly don't know anything about the origin of life, but we simply don't know whether in principle on other planets a very rapid process, or whether in fact it's almost impossible to happen. I mean, you can have as many versions of the argument as you like.
Yeah, and just for clarification, where I got the 10 billion, it was basically from the moment of the Big Bang to the moment we seem to have evidence of life on Earth was the 10 billion years. But
Oh, well,
that
that's fine, and thank you for that. But why that actually matters for a rather special reason, which is not directly related to your question, and that is, of course, that we have good evidence that there are very many solar systems which significantly predate our solar system. We have solar systems. Well, actually, there's evidence of planets, I believe, going back to 12 billion years. Whether they had life on them is a different question. And so, in that sense, there are probably Earth-like planets which predate our Earth by maybe 3 or 4 billion years. And that, of course, begs all sorts of questions with respect to if they actually spawned intelligent life, which decided to have a wander around the galaxy, then they've had 4 billion years head start on us. That's a slightly different point. But, even
yeah,
so, on the grand scale of things, these arguments are actually quite important.
right. And I do think we're going to get into that near the end of the episode when we talk about some of those myths, and you have your myth number 6 about extraterrestrials. But I want to finish this point. Where I'm trying to go with this is a couple observations that leads to believe that it almost looks like life was pre-programmed to just unfurl itself. And so the timeline, the rapidity of that is the one observation. But there's another one that you've done a lot of writing and speaking on, and that's the aspect of convergence. How different life forms from entirely different lineages kept falling back on the same solutions to a problem. And not just very different lineages, but even at very different periods of time, as if the information is kept in storage somehow in a freezer and keeps getting hauled out under various circumstances. In your book and elsewhere, you've referred to the processes of evolution being, quote, seeded with inevitabilities. And you've talked about the high likelihood of various outcomes. So maybe tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I'm a little nervous about your description of, if you like, there's a sort of locker or a storage unit in which you just wander off and get the bits and pieces you need. I mean, don't misunderstand, at least my view. It is that these things are the product of evolution. Whether the evolutionary processes are directly related to natural selection and so forth, we could leave perhaps for another day. It's not. I don't think it's frantically important. The fact of the matter is that we have every reason to think that evolution has happened. So here we are talking about it, which is of no mean feat in my view. With regard to evolutionary convergence, I mean, that in its own way is a very commonplace observation, although perhaps, relatively speaking, had been neglected. Although, as I wrote not so long ago when I was reviewing a colleague's book, I liked the book very much, but I've concluded the review by saying, well, in my view, convergence is becoming much too popular. And I think there's been quite an increase in study on convergence, and that's all fine and large. But speaking personally, when some area becomes too popular, I'm off. I'll go and do something different. I'm not interested in, I did my work, and certainly I wasn't the first in the field by a long way. There was actually a very interesting Soviet scientist who made very important contributions to this area in the 1920s. So, I'm by no means the originator of these ideas. But with respect to convergence, as you mentioned, effectively it's the observation that from unrelated, more or less starting points, you end up with very much the same solution. One's always got to observe to begin with to the best of our knowledge, life itself only has one origin on its planet. So some people would object to the fact that, you've got a starting point here, and it may well be that even the genetic structure of the first cell, in a certain sense, predetermined what was likely to happen, what was unlikely to happen. I mean, I don't think it's anything as simple as that. But even so, I think that there is a point which is valid, and that is that if you look at all the number of potential alternatives of biological organization, that the total number is just stupidly large. It's far, far bigger than the number of elementary particles in the universe. I mean, that's a small change. Whereas they're sort of 10 to the 200. I mean, these are unimaginably big numbers. Whereas in point of fact, we seem to see that at least on this planet, the degree of recurrence suggests that in the end, the total number of solutions is really rather limited. And with regard to these very big numbers and so forth, it's quite difficult, unless you're a mathematician, which I'm not, to explain that even if you talk about 10 to the 80 and then 10 to the 120, these are, magnificently different numbers. And we're really talking broadly, I think, in the order of maybe 10 to the 4, 10 to the 6, something of that order, which is an infinitesimally small fraction of what potentially might have evolved. And the majority of people would sort of say, well, that's just a set of chance events. It could have gone that way, it could have gone this way. But when you look at the many examples of convergence which I've documented, and these, of course, are drawing on other people's work, needless to say, it's none of my own work and the like, one is first of all struck by the degree of similarity, and I can give you some surprising examples if we have time. But also something I do mention in my book is that almost invariably in describing such examples of convergence, many of my colleagues almost always the adjectives they use are adjectives of surprise. They say this is, uncanny, this is amazing, this is extraordinary. And I would say, just as an evolutionary biologist, well, why? I mean, for goodness sake, the world's got to work in a certain way. So if you see, to take the classic example, the structure of the eye in the octopus and the structure of the eye in the human, if you're not a biologist, they look practically identical. If you're a biologist, you actually can see that each one has its own evolutionary footprint, which indicates that they, although ultimately came from a common ancestor which probably had some sort of vision, by no stretch of the imagination would this common ancestor, living about the time of the Burgess Shale, did it possess this complex camera eye. So that's a nice example of convergence. On the other hand, are camera eyes the only eyes in town? Not at all. There are about 50 or 60 different sorts of eye. Some eyes use mirrors, for example, so on and so forth. But overall, I think the degree of convergence does suggest that although in principle there's an almost infinitely large number of possible alternatives, the reality is that the vast number of them are impossible rather than they've never been discovered. They simply don't work.
And I'd like to build on that. So we talk about the eye, for example. One of the main components would be the light sensor, and we won't get into the details. We could, but I won't. But basically, there's a molecule, an opsin, that can sense light. It actually changes its shape when it senses light, and you couple that with a switch, basically, and you've got a light sensor that can be used by a brain. So that's partly what I was getting at earlier when I said, reaching into the freezer and pulling out a solution. If you have two organisms, the ancestors of the octopus and the ancestors of the humans, and they want to have this light sensing ability, it will begin with probably those molecules that sense light. A similar example I wanted to point to was voltage sensing. There's other proteins that when they experience a change in voltage, they change shape. Just like this one that senses light, it changes shape and it's coupled to a switch. And so now you have a voltage sensor for an ion channel for the nerves and muscles to work, very different organs. But you can also use the very same voltage sensor in an enzyme that turns on. So again, that idea that you reach into the freezer, you say, okay, we need something that senses voltage and then turns on a switch. Well, there's one in there in the gene pool somewhere, and animals, organisms can build on those ideas. So that's one explanation, I think, for this convergence. You have common goals, sensing light, for example. Well, reach in the freezer, and we have a few out of the millions and millions of possible configurations. There's a couple, two or three, that fit the bill perfectly.
No, I think that's perfectly fair. Of course, the thing is that the opsins, as you know better than I do, belong to a much larger class of proteins, G-coupled protein receptors, et cetera,
Right.
I believe. And they are used for a whole humongous range of operations. So that's absolutely fine. I mean, in its own way, perhaps to give you gratification, maybe not, is one of the examples I came across some years ago, and I haven't actually chased that literature for the last couple of years, involves, as you and I will know perfectly well, that the sensory proteins which are used in the eye find exact parallels in the other sensory systems, including olfaction and taste.
Right.
And they too use the same sort of arrangement of these transmembrane proteins. That's all fine and large. Now, it turns out extraordinarily interesting, and I think this is still valid. Trouble with science, it always moves on. Is when they were looking at the olfactory, that is the proteins used for smell in the insects, you'd expect them to use exactly the same opsin-like molecules which we use in our eyes and we also use in our noses, fine and large. It turns out, in fact, they don't. They have recruited a completely different molecule, which from a distance looks indistinguishable from the classic arrangement which we associate with the olfactory receptors in our noses. And what fascinates me about this is, first of all, that you can show, because they have some very subtle differences in this molecule, which show this does have a separate ancestry, it probably comes from some sort of enzyme, is why on earth did the insects throw away a perfectly reasonable system, presumably, and use this new system? And my guess, which again is based on other people's suggestion, is that the sort of world in which the insects live, and I think this is something biologists occasionally forget, is really in some respects very, very alien to our own. And this actually has all sorts of bearings on animal intelligence and other sort of things like that. And it may well be the way in which insects encounter their olfactory information, if you like, in sort of clouds of material, may actually, the way as they fly through this material, this other alternative may actually provide an advantage. I don't know, but it's very, very striking.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing this discussion correctly, it seems like the constraint is the environment. In other words, you have all these possibilities, but you have a particular environment that we exist in. And that's the thing that shapes, that determines what of that myriad of possibilities will in fact come to be, because it gives an advantage to a particular organism. Have I got it basically right?
I think that's absolutely correct. And in a certain way, one could sort of look around you saying, for goodness sake, this is not rocket science. I mean, this may sound like a rather technical example, and it does need a tiny bit of unpacking, but it was actually a fairly recent paper. But for various reasons, most of our nervous tissue, our nerves, have a layer of fatty material around them. And this is known as myelin, okay? And it has a very, very characteristic structure. It's highly laminar. It looks like it's a minute number of layers. And effectively what it allows the propagation of the electrical signal along the nerve to be constrained, because this thing effectively acts as an insulation. It's a bit like the rubber round a wire. Okay. Yeah. That's fine and large, all terribly interesting. But you then go and look at the little organelles found in blue-green algae, which are involved with photosynthesis. And you see that the structure surrounding those is practically identical to what we see in the insulatory material around a nerve. And it's got nothing to do with common ancestry. It's because the basic biochemistry of the way in which, in fact, you're moving material across these membranes is, for all intents and purposes, identical. The actual functions are entirely different. But the reality of the world is, if you want to do this ionic transfer, this is the best way to do it. So that's why convergence, I think, is interesting. And indeed, just to echo what you were saying, if you have a particular environment where things have to happen in a particular way, or you were referring back a moment ago to these other proteins which are involved with electrical propagation, the same sort of basic rules apply. So we should not be surprised that we have so many examples of convergence.
Simon, you mentioned earlier a term that a lot of listeners wouldn't recognize. I've often thought about doing an episode specifically on it. So you mentioned G protein coupled receptors, or I refer to them as GPCRs. And again, I'd often thought someday I need to do an episode on these things. So let's see what we can do with it here. So as you mentioned, we have this complex molecule made up of thousands of amino acids. And this massive molecule has several important parts or modules built into it. But there's two parts or modules that I really want to pay attention to here. One part of that huge GPCR molecule, it recognizes the small chemical that gets activated by light. And the second part of that GPCR molecule is a switch that gets turned on when it sees that light-activated chemical. And this is behind the whole pathway that gives us vision. We were talking about that. But here's why I want to talk about this molecule to give it a whole episode of its own. Cells have learned to do a lot of tricks with this GPCR supermolecule. They can swap out the module that recognizes the light-activated chemical and replace it with a nearly identical module that recognizes cinnamon or methane or sulfur or 1,000 other airborne molecules. And again, that chemical recognizing module flips a switch, the second module, and this then gets used in your nose to give you your sense of smell. Or other cells in your mouth do the same thing. They swap in a similar module to give you the sense of taste, just recognizing salts and sugars and all kinds of tastes. But cells can also swap out that light sensing or odor sensing module and replace it with a module that recognizes chemicals like acetylcholine or adrenaline, dopamine, oxytocin, and dozens of other neurotransmitters. And again, those neurotransmitter sensing modules flip the switch, and this becomes a key component to how your nerves talk to each other. Or the cells can swap in a module that flexes when a pressure is applied to it, and flexing of that module again activates a switch, and this is used by other cells to give you your sense of touch, or pressure, or tension. Other cells swap in a module that senses hormones in your blood and the lymphatics. Immune cells swap in modules that sense cytokines. We don't have enough time to talk about all the different ways that GPCRs can be modified, but the main point I'm making here is that evolution produced all these modules that you can swap in and out and expand the ways that cells can experience their environment and respond to it, by activating that switch module. And this is an example of what I was talking about earlier about cells reaching into the freezer and finding a solution, a module that recognizes something and flips a switch.
Well, that's true, except to say the example of the insects is in a way confirms it from the point of view of convergence, but actually has recruited a completely different molecule which has a different ancestry. So indeed, what's really saying is that basic structure has to be the way it is for the system to work. And another example, which I've banged on about at some length, again, needs a bit of unpacking, is an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And this is essential for mediation of carbon dioxide. And everything on the planet which is alive needs carbonic anhydrase. That's fine and large. And I've argued this in some of my own work, that from day one assumes that because carbon dioxide has got to be mediated in one way or another, it's going to need this enzyme, which accelerates the reaction as these enzymes do. So that's perfectly all right. But it turns out, in fact, that once again, carbonic anhydrase, to the best of our knowledge, has evolved independently 5 times, maybe even 8 times. And the reason we think it's independent is because what we call the central site, which is actually doing all the heavy lifting, and almost invariably, but not always, but almost invariably uses a zinc atom, not quite an atom, but the similar thing. And it has a couple of 3 adjacent amino acids. And that, again, is not completely invariant, but even so, there's a very strong recurrence of it. So what is the local advantage, apparently, in moving to a new sort of carbonic anhydrase, which presumably was recruited from some other protein? So it's really the two sides of the coin. I see where you're coming from, and that's perfectly reasonable. And you're sort of saying this is the way you need to sort of, make the thing work. And you refer to the storeroom or the locker room as a metaphor. I don't like it very much, but even so, I can see it as a way of explaining things.
Well, it's a metaphor of the genes in the nucleus, of the cell. I'm obviously not referring to a literal freezer or whatever.
No, sure. Yeah, but on the other hand, one can sort of say, well, actually, in the grand scheme of things, I don't really care where these things come from. I'm not, frankly, terribly interested. I'm not even actually terribly interested in the genome. I mean, that's all fine and large, and there are many people working on that, and good luck to them. But all I want to know is that if you want to mediate carbon dioxide, then you're going to have to use carbonic anhydrase, as I say in a couple of places. If that's true on this planet, given its ubiquity of convergence, being reinvented maybe 8 times, then you can be pretty sure that anywhere in the universe where you've got carbon-based life forms, they are going to use something which we call carbonic anhydrase. So in that sense, you can say that evolution and biology has a degree of predictability. And that's okay, because chemists and physicists do this all the time. They're very happy with predictions.
So would all of these things that we're talking about for the past 10 or 15 minutes, would these be what you're referring to when you, in your books, in your talks, you've mentioned evolution being, again, in air quotes, seeded with inevitabilities?
I think so. Yes. Of course, we have the advantage of hindsight, and of course we might discuss what's coming in the future, which is mostly terrifying, but that's a slightly different story, perhaps. But it is indeed that as we can understand things, what we see is that, first of all, if there's one molecule which for one reason or another is not available, then the thing which is recruited is very, very similar to what is otherwise, quote, needed. And the second thing we see is again and again and again, and this is actually very dramatically shown in many parts of the nervous system, many of the molecules you need in the nervous system, especially in the operation of what we call the synapses, have evolved in effectively single-celled organisms. So in other words, they're recruited to a new function. And that again should hardly surprise us, because once again, a little bit like the example of the myelin and the photosynthetic organelles, what exactly does a synapse do? Then it's really dealing with chemical transmission. Well, that's something which goes almost to the beginning of life. So we can't really be surprised if, in fact, it's recruited for this new function. That's absolutely fine. That's the way the world is. So in fact, ironically, the amount of novelty in evolution at one level is surprisingly limited. Evolution is terribly lazy. If it's got something, which on the factory floor, so to use the metaphor, then it's going to use it.
Yeah. It seems like evolution, to use a metaphor, is the ultimate opportunist. It just, the easiest path is the one that it will take.
Well, yes, and it shouldn't really surprise us.
No, it shouldn't.
Sort of way.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
So this idea that I'm at least working with, and I think we're talking about right now, is this idea that there's a lot of outcomes written into the genes, apparently. And it seems to have been even early in the game when Earth formed, because how quickly life appeared and just immediately began to complexify. That's the one observation. But then when it keeps on coming on the similar solutions to physiological and environmental problems, that's also what I think points towards it's written in the genes, as it were. This is very different from what Stephen Jay Gould was talking about. He sees evolution as being completely random. That whole idea of rewinding the tape and starting again, you'll come up with something very different. But it almost seems like what's written in the genes will keep on coming up with similar solutions.
I think that's correct. I'm slightly nervous of the word gene these days, in as much as well as you and I know perfectly well, although indeed there's a genetic code, and in a certain sense you don't think of that except that unless you want to avoid disaster. But of course, in terms of all the downstream mechanisms which are responsible for both the embryology and then the function of the cell, it's a very, very complex system. So yes, the gene again is a convenient metaphor for what in its own way is an extremely complex system. And to a certain extent, if you look at what are most likely the more primitive forms of life, which are equivalent more or less to bacteria, and then compare them to the so-called eukaryotes, to the first approximation, it's only amongst the eukaryotes, those are things like mushrooms and plants and animals and so forth, that first of all you have sexual reproduction, which probably is one of the big accelerators in evolution. And correspondingly also, it's really the time when you get so-called multicellularity, so bodies, in a manner of speaking, are pretty well the prerogative of the eukaryotes, and they have some approximations within the bacteria. So, but what is interesting about the eukaryotes is that although they are in some ways much more complex, there are two things we can observe. First of all, actually, within the prokaryotes, there are approximations to convergences, which are actually quite striking. Similarities, because they're often thought to be relatively simple, but actually there are certain key things which are thought to be restricted to the eukaryotes. Actually, we find analogues of those in the bacteria, things analogous, for instance, to the so-called nuclear envelope, the thing which surrounds the nucleus. But much more importantly is again and again we find within the bacteria various proteins which have various functions. And these once again are recruited and play a crucial role in the eukaryotic, for instance, the so-called cytoskeleton. So there's an awful lot of stuff. A lot of the heavy lifting is being done by the bacteria or their equivalents back in the deep Precambrian. And these are then recruited, so to speak, by the eukaryotes. So once again, it's, as we say, evolution is opportunistic.
Oh.
And maybe I'll clarify, because this is something that probably the three of us know, but maybe some of our listeners don't know. You're talking about solutions to physiological environmental problems that appeared in the bacteria are then employed in the eukaryotes, which are a whole different form of life. But the thing that defines them is the fact that they arose from one unicellular organism engulfing another one, not eating it and digesting it, but incorporating it, so that now you have a bug inside of a bug. And the bug inside then specializes, becomes quite different. It no longer is a fully formed cell, an independent cell. It's completely dependent on the host that engulfed it. And so one of the things it's specialized to do is produce energy. We talked about that last week with Dr. Freeland. But here, Simon, you're mentioning, maybe you want to get into more detail, that the solutions that the bacteria came up with millions and maybe a billion years beforehand are now employed by the later eukaryote, which essentially is that bacterium now living inside another unicellular organism. Do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
Well, not to use a technicality, I think you're referring to the mitochondria.
Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And indeed, the consensus is that indeed they were once free-living bacteria and they've been incorporated. And so the things which make aerobic metabolism using oxygen essential for us depends on the mitochondria within the individual cell. Actually, there are a few people who suggest that classic theory of so-called endosymbiosis may be incorrect. And the only reason I mention this is not because I think it's necessarily correct, but simply to remind your listeners in particular that science is based on hypotheses. In other words, even things which end up in the textbooks, heaven help us, quite often turn out to be gloriously wrong. I'm not saying this one is, but more importantly, this evidence for the incorporation of once free living cells into another cell, where eventually they surrender, if you like, their autonomy and become entirely dependent on their host cell, actually that's in its own way. With the case of the mitochondria, it's not clear. The jury's still out. It may have only happened once. But such examples of so-called endosymbiosis are very widespread and they're very convergent. And it's a beautiful example because the parallel to the mitochondria is the acquisition of what were probably equivalent to blue-green algae, which are incorporated into the things which we now call plants. So that their photosynthetic ability is dependent on having these now no longer free-living blue-green algae, which we call chloroplasts. That's fine and large. Except that there's a wonderful example of an unrelated form, a sort of amoeba, which is doing exactly the same thing at the moment, where it's incorporating an alga, which is busy losing its autonomy and is being busy incorporated. And the whole set of evolutionary stories as to how this thing is incorporated rather than being rejected, how genetic information is transferred, how an extensive loss of genetic information from the newly acquired cell actually happens. This is something we see again and again and again. And that again, from my way of thinking, I'm so interested in this because, of course, it points to common solution. It points to, if you like, a narrative, which we know in the end we can say, oh, well, I'm not surprised by this. What else did we ever expect?
Right. All of these are examples of something we've talked about a few times in the past, several times in our episodes. Everyone has heard of the struggle for survival, and we've talked about there's also this aspect of the snuggle for survival. Organisms and animals learning to work together. And this is not just simply a cooperation. This is actually exchange of information, as Dr. Conway Morris was just saying. It's a snuggle for survival, and these are all great examples of that.
You know, I have a great interest in marine life, and I have kept marine aquariums over the years. And one of the most fascinating creatures to have is an anemone. And they host what are called zoanthuli in their tissues. And those zoanthuli use sunlight to produce things that the host then it gets it. So is that a similar kind of symbiosis? Is that a similar thing to what we're talking about?
Oh, very much so. And again, the story there is, and this is actually even more dramatically shown in some cases of the insects. I don't think we necessarily have to unpack this in great detail. But in such examples, what happens is the symbionts in themselves crucially provide either nutrients or other sort of genetic material which are not available to the host tissue. So in other words, to a certain extent, they're dependent on each other. And in the case of these particular insects, the degree of integration is simply staggering. It's just absolutely extraordinary. But once again, this is not exactly surprising because, of course, as we know in terms of our diets, we know perfectly well that you can choose to restrict your diet to certain food types. But if you take certain decisions, then you have to be extremely careful with regard to some of the nutrients. You know, and I won't go into all the details, but, you know, one knows perfectly well that if you make various dietary choices, then if you're well informed as to what you may be lacking in terms of what you actually need, then you can run into some problems. And this, in a certain sense, is because we're making a free choice about this, and that's a different set of stories, and there might be some ethical view and so on and so forth. But yeah, but that's exactly the same point. Yeah.
So this recent idea in the popular press of the biome, the fact that we have more bacteria living in us than we do our own cells. I mean, there's a symbiosis there as well, right? That this is all cooperating together to make us alive, make us be able to function.
Yeah, well, one's got to remember, of course, the bacteria are very much smaller than we are. So although that's a sort of dramatic sounding fact, they're thousands the size of us. So you're not surprised there's so many of them. But again, this is not my area of specialization, far from it. But it's fairly clear that the sort of gut microbiota actually is very important, not only in terms of the digestion of food, but it also has, so to speak, conversations with the immune system. And also it has probably a connection to nervous development and nervous tissue and so forth. So having these things in a good shape is actually something which then reflects in the rest of the body. So the whole thing in its own way is highly integrated. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the bacteria play an essential role in our well-being. And they might well look at it as if they ever could from entirely the other way around and say, well, thank goodness for these humans wandering around. You know, we've got a safe and wonderful place. You know, we've got yards of intestine to live in, and, you know, it's warm and comfortable. And, you know, what's there to worry about?
Right.
Okay, at this point, I think we should change directions a little bit. We had intended to talk a lot about convergence, and there's much more that we could say, but We also want to leave some time for your book and several of the myths that were described or discussed in that book. To some extent, we've already done some of that. Myth number 1 is basically evolution is random or not random, and we've talked about that. Myth number 2, well, for the sake of time, let me jump ahead. Myth number 4 is about missing links. This idea comes up often in conversations that Christians have about evolution, particularly those that are of more of a fundamentalist persuasion. They still think that missing links are a major problem for evolutionists. Here's an example. I was recently asked to review a book for a Christian Faith and Science magazine, and the book was written by a couple fundamentalists to expose the flaws of neo-Darwinism as they saw it. And they claimed there's just too many missing links, that this is one of their arguments against neo-Darwinism entirely. So that pushback is still out there. I'm surprised, but it is. So what do we say about this misunderstanding, or is it a misrepresentation about missing links?
Well, when I used the word myths in my latest book, I mean, I'm being to some sense very provocative. And
Right.
when I say, for instance, the myth of missing links, or indeed the myth of mass extinctions and so on and so forth, I don't mean that they're imaginary or anything like that. My perspective actually is that they're far more interesting than we could possibly imagine. Now, so far as the people who wrote the book you just mentioned, I would very politely suggest that, first of all, they look at the fossil record, and second, and more importantly, to remind ourselves the fossil record is not perfect, but as we discussed much earlier, to the first approximation, day by day and year by year, the new fossils which you find almost invariably confirm the narrative we already have. The thing which interests me about the missing links is that, to take a couple of classic examples, there's the transformation from something living in the water as a fish, which actually is quite closely related to the living lungfish and coelacanths, to something which is on land and the fins become limbs and so forth. In my view, the fossil record there is unequivocal as to how this actually happened. And this is something which happened principally in the late Silurian and in the Devonian. But correspondingly, what very much struck me when I was reading the literature in this area some years ago is, in point of fact, several groups within this so-called, what we call a clade, were actually more or less doing the same thing independently, so that quasi-independently within this fish group, independently, there were various lineages which were moving towards evolving a limb and a hand. Okay, so it wasn't simply that it was a monotonic succession of species A, species B, down to species Z, they're eventually leading from a fish to an amphibian, as we call it. So the point there is that, just for the sake of argument, if one of these episodes had been derailed, had just, failed for one reason or another, the lake had shrunk or there had been a meteorite impact, then one doesn't have to worry, because there are lots of other groups which are very much doing the same thing, admittedly within the same lineage, though examples of convergence can extend that argument to other sorts of fish. So, for instance, we have a variety of fish which are able to live on land. They're not doing the other same sort of things, but you think of mud skippers and things like that. And amongst the things you've got to do is, of course, you've got to change your vision. Vision in water is really very different from vision in air. So we can be detained on all that thing. And then a parallel story comes from what seems to be generally accepted, and that is a derivation of the birds, not only from the dinosaurs, but from a group we call the theropod dinosaurs. And these are bipedal dinosaurs. And we know that many of them actually had feathers, though they couldn't fly. And so most evolutionary biologists say, well, okay, the reason why feathers evolved may have been for sexual display, very likely, and or as these birds get smaller, their surface area increases in terms of their volume, and therefore, if you're becoming more and more warm-blooded, as you're becoming more and more energetic, then feathers provide an insulation against heat loss. But the net result is that one can show pretty certainly, but again, it's something which can always be revised, that something like a bird evolved at least 3 times independently, and maybe more. So again, going back to your original point you were making about convergence, one can sort of say, well, really, by the time we've got a theropod dinosaur in the Triassic, even though it doesn't really look much like a bird, we can be pretty sure that in due course, especially as they get smaller, especially as the scales develop into feather-like structures, then something which eventually will become flying is more or less an inevitability. So the myth of missing links is not that there aren't missing links, there are missing links, but actually the missing links suggest that if one experiment fails, then don't worry, there's somebody else just around the corner who's going to do the thing for you.
Is there also, I think it was in one of Richard Dawkins' books on evolution, he talks about the fact that, in a sense, there's no such thing as a missing link, because everything is, first of all, it's a very gradual. So you're not going to go from a fish to a land animal. Like there's not going to be a link there. It's a very gradual process, and so the fact that we have examples of animals, even current animals, at different stages in that process, is indicative of evolution, but that we shouldn't be, in a sense, we shouldn't be looking for some, big link, some big jump between a species or something like that. Evolution doesn't work that way. Is that fair as well?
I think that's perfectly fair. Yes, I mean, even within biological circles, not so much today, there were people who did entertain the possibility there really was such a dramatic reorganization. They literally jumped into what was rather unkindly referred to as hopeful monsters and all the rest of it. But in part because of what we now know about the way the genome works and so forth, and also especially from the fossil record, it's patently clear that even though the fossil record is grievously imperfect, it's not sufficiently disastrous that you can't actually see the principal narrative. And once again, if a new theropod dinosaur turns up, then which actually is yet another lineage which is doing this thing, I won't be surprised. But what I would be amazed is that the fundamental evolutionary story we have about both the fish amphibian and the theropod dinosaur bird transition will be revised. That seems to be as secure as we can make it at the moment.
I also think, to go against what you were saying, both of you were saying a couple of minutes ago about how you don't have these big leaps and sudden changes. In one sense, we do. If you look, for example, at dogs are one species, but you can have completely different looking dogs. You compare, a Great Dane to a Chihuahua, to a German Shepherd, to a Saint Bernard, to a Dachshund. When you just look at their fossils, they look like completely different animals. You can see, okay, maybe they're tied together in that they have 4 legs and some similar body plan, but otherwise you say these are 5 different species of animals, but they're not.
I don't understand anything about the genetics of dogs, but I believe that they lend themselves to this malleability. And you don't, for instance, see that in cats. Okay, there are various varieties, but they don't show that plasticity which you associate with the dogs. And of course, we've got to remind ourselves, as Darwin did with his pigeon story in The Origin, that these things, Labradors and Spaniels and the rest of them, they are, if you like, human whims. We have decided, what we want to breed in that direction. But more importantly, if the dogs revert, in other words, if they don't spend their entire time on a cushion, but become semi-feral, then they effectively revert to an all-standard mutt. And, the dogs which we had a spaniel for many years, which we were greatly fond of, that would not survive out there for more than a few generations. It would revert to your all-purpose hound. And that's indeed when you go to most parts of the world where people don't have the luxury of either breeding dogs in this way, or more importantly, they need dogs for other functions. They do not look like your standard showcase dog, I can assure you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, gentlemen, we're getting close on the time. We have time maybe for one or more of these myths in the book. Simon, I'll put the ball in your court. There's myth number 5, which is human exceptionalism, which I think is about how humans are different from all the animals on Earth. Or myth number 6, which is extraterrestrials and Fermi paradox. I'll let you decide, Simon, where you want to begin and end.
Well, actually, we can deal with this very quickly indeed. I'm being slightly facetious here. Extraterrestrials, bad news, there aren't any. Thank you very much. Right, next question, please. Thank you. There should be, but there seems to be a lack of evidence. But that doesn't mean they're not there. But even so, the Fermi paradox seems to be coming home with a vengeance. But, I just should say in parenthesis, and I think we're still waiting for new information. There, amongst the exoplanets, there is one which might have an ocean, and within that ocean there might be a spectroscopic signature for a molecule which is only made by organic forms, and that would be indicative of some sort of biosphere. But it's a tentative signal. I wait with eagerness. It's the James Webb Telescope to see whether this thing is confirmed. It's a hint, no more than that. But even so, at the moment, the jury is not optimistic about aliens.
Just so the listeners know, you refer to the Fermi paradox, which I understand that's basically, if they were out there, we would have seen them by now, but we don't. That's the paradox, right?
Yes, we would either have signals, or we would have evidence from the fossil record, which is not as silly an idea as it sounds. We don't have time to go into all the details, but there have been a number of searches, not so much for signals, but for very, very advanced civilizations, which would leave a very distinctive signature around a star or even a galaxy. And all of those have drawn a blank so far. And this gives me pause for thought.
And just a couple questions that sit in my mind when you say that they're just not out there. So, for example, intergalactic travel isn't very quick. And so even if they found us, it would take a fair amount of time for them to come and visit us. But then there's this aspect of Earth has been developing life for let's call it 4 billion years. And it's only been in the last 100 that we've been sending out signals out into space that people could actually notice that there is life here on Earth. And when you do the math, 100 years out of 4 billion if you put that on that time clock that I mentioned earlier about how, Earth forming at midnight and multicellular life not until noon and humans later on in the evening, on that clock, the 100 years out of the 4 billion amounts to 2 milliseconds. And so they would have had to have been looking during that 2 millisecond period to even know that there was anything here. And if they happened to blink, they just wouldn't have seen us.
That's correct. And indeed, it's a very fair point. I mean, as I think I mentioned earlier, though, there's very good evidence that many, many solar systems far, far predate our solar system. And if you make assumptions about them being habitable, if you make assumptions about the evolution of intelligence, which evolutionary convergence suggests, if you make assumptions about technology, and that may lead us to human exceptionalism quite quickly, in fact, then one would expect that there would be people probably 2 billion years ago wandering around the galaxy. And actually, we wouldn't be here because this place would have been colonized by some other civilization. So it's that head start which gives some people considerable pause for thought. But indeed so.
And again, the gentle pushback I'll give is in the past 100 years, we developed technology enough that we could send signals that they might have been able to detect. But in another 100 years, we have enough technology that we're going to eliminate ourselves. And whether we represent the norm, that whether life on Earth, whether humans on Earth represent the norm, if they do, then yes, those other life forms could have come out 4 billion years ago, but they've long ago killed themselves in a nuclear explosion or a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And so it's just that idea that the window of opportunity of noticing another civilization in another part of the galaxy and living long enough to travel to them and interact with them, there's problems there, I think.
Oh, I agree entirely. And that indeed is one of the 70-odd explanations for the Fermi paradox, is that we blow ourselves up or die of some hideous infection. And that may be the case. I mean, we don't have time. I'm actually cautiously optimistic here, in fact. And that actually almost leads into, well, it almost segues, as I think the Americans say, into a human exceptionalism. And that is that, although, beyond a shadow of doubt, in my opinion, we are descendants of primates and so forth. I'm not none of that dispute. I'm more struck these days by, the staggeringly obvious differences between ourselves and animals. And one can unpack this in all sorts of ways. But as an anecdote almost, and this is a paper I came across relatively recently, and as we know that many animals are social, and that's actually, there are many good reasons why they should be social. And moreover, in fact, if these individuals are separated, you can think of dolphins and chimpanzees and gorillas and all our favorite elephants, all our favorite examples. If they're separated for some time and then they come together, they greet each other with enormous enthusiasm, and they recognize each other and they're not stupid and all the rest of it. There's a lot of, hugging and kissing and whatever else they do. But they never say goodbye, never, ever say farewell. So when one animal wanders off somewhere, they don't sort of call or wave or call after and take care of yourself or anything like that. And I think, although this seems to be just a minor anecdote, in fact, it tells me an enormous amount about the fact that, to the first approximation, animals have no future. They just cannot see into the future. It doesn't exist as far as they're concerned. And that in its own way is perhaps not so surprising. After all, why should they? But correspondingly, and much more importantly, is they can't think of alternatives. They can't think of counterfactuals. Whereas we, of course, spend our entire time thinking about alternatives, both in terms of alternative histories, supposing I hadn't done this, blah, de blah, and the like. So that's one, I think, very telling anecdote. And the other one, which is, I think, very striking, is one could show very striking examples of animals using tools. But there are two observations worth making here. The first is that, and I simplify very slightly here, but no animal ever uses one tool to make another tool. And this is essential if you want a so-called cumulative technology. If you're always using one tool to do one thing, then that's absolutely fine. And it's got a rather sporadic distribution amongst the animal kingdom. And actually, there's no very strong correlation with intelligence, but that's a slightly different story. So that tells me quite a lot. But also, if you go, for instance, to the chimpanzees, now a splendid example, because obviously we're closely related to them. And one of the things they do is that the males hunt, and we can get diverted into that if you like. But principally, the females, so I understand, learn to use rocks to bring down with some force and crack open nuts.
Right.
And of course, the nuts have a nutritious kernel, fine and large. Okay. And they have their young chimpanzees standing or sitting beside them and so forth. And they're watching what the mother's doing. And this enormous great rock goes bang like that. And after several times, they think. But when the young chimpanzee does this, doesn't get any instruction from the mother. You must be joking. Gets none at all. And I think the reason for this is that the animal cannot get into the mind of the other animal. It cannot regard itself both as a teacher and as a pupil. Whereas, of course, when we teach in particular, although we may not be very good at it, what we're really trying to do is understand what's going inside the pupil's mind. And then what's absolutely terrifying is not only does the pupil understand what you're telling him or her, but actually then tells you how to do it better. It says, oh, well, you should have thought of doing it this sort of way. And that's something which, again, is very, very telling. So animals certainly learn, animals certainly memorize, but what they can't do is instruct. And I can give you various other examples there. And this is not, I must emphasize, not trying to denigrate animals or in any sort of sense, indicate some sort of inferiority. What the animals do, they do fantastically well. And they do it because that's what they need to do fantastically well. We're the ones who are really anomalous. We're very, very peculiar indeed. And most obviously, although there's more to it than that, of course, we have language. And again, I think that the idea that you see vocalizations in various groups of animals as being precursors to language is actually very misguided. It's nothing to do with that at all. And this is most obvious in birdsong, because birdsong in a number of ways has very striking analogies to human language in a whole set of ways. But actually, when you look at it a bit more closely, it's not a language at all, not least because although the birdsong is used for very specific functions, the sounds they make are never exported for some completely new use. Whereas, of course, with our languages, which are not exclusively but principally recursive, so we can embed meaning within meaning within meaning. But within that, as soon as we start using language, we're spending all our time talking in metaphor. We're spending all our time talking about analogies. And this, too, is something which I think is simply a closed book to the animal. So I'm fascinated as to how this difference came about. And again, a bit like the Cambrian explosion, there are many, many alternative hypotheses. Size of social group, genetic changes, increase in brain size, all sorts of possibilities. Any one of those might be right, but by and large, none of them seem to be convincing.
This question comes up a lot in a conversation like this. People will ask, well, is this a difference in kind or a difference in degree? And another way to say the same thing, is it just because the animals are on the lower end of an exponential rise, we are way ahead of them, but we were on the same bottom end of the exponential curve? When you compare what we were probably like back 50 or 100,000 years ago, or a comparison to Neanderthals, for example, or if you compare a child at 1-year-old or 2-year-old, both those Neanderthals and a child can show incredible potential and incredible intelligence, but they just don't, it hasn't been brought to fruition. But once give that person 10 or 20 years, or give the species another 20,000 years, they do show that the manifestation of that potential. And so again, the whole question is, are the animals on the same curve? They're just behind us a long ways, or are we just on a completely different curve?
Well, in one sense, that must be correct, because after all, we are a product of evolution. And indeed, it's very fair to point out to a child, with regard to children, both my children and now my grandchildren and so forth, it's fascinating to see what they can and cannot do at certain stages. But my goodness, Peter, they move quickly. Especially acquisition of language is absolutely staggering. But that said, ideas which we take for granted when we're maybe 10 years old are simply unavailable to a 6-month. But again and again, the more one looks at this, the more the evidence suggests that most of these human properties are actually there in very, very young children indeed. And indeed, the point about the Neanderthals and indeed previous species as to what extent they were, if you like, human and like. And I think within the human lineage, it is that curve which we all belong to. But I think, and again, I'm looking at other people's work here, but if we look at our stone tools, which can be traced back, the best part of 2.5 million years, maybe a bit more than that. So I read is that the chimpanzees use stones to break things. Some of the New World monkeys do as well, and that is convergent, and that is actually has a function. So that's perfectly reasonable. But for instance, when a New World monkey smashes a stone, not infrequently it ends up with some very sharp blades, which by chance are broken off the stone. But they never think to pick those up and cut something with them. If you make a great deal of effort, you can train an animal to do something like that, but they won't do it ab initio. And the argument is that even amongst what we would regard as extremely primitive stone tools, really the first ones, there is something there which is, if you like, that the person is using this as an extension of their mind. It is part of them. And they are, in a sense, manipulating something because they know what they want. So it's got a purposeness to it, which we simply don't see in the formation and creation of animal tools. Animals may use tools to do things, that's absolutely fine. But what they're not doing, to the first approximation, is actually modifying. I mean, there are some examples in chimpanzees of sticks and chewing the ends and various things like this. But, this is nothing to do with what we're doing there. So, yeah. So we're on the same curve, if you like. But on the other hand, there are lots of other intelligent species which significantly predate us. The dolphins are a very striking example of this, because they had large brains of about equivalent to the early humans around about 15 million years ago. And they've been doing the same thing ever since. And I think, as I've written elsewhere, with respect to the chimpanzees, one could be dead sure that in 5 million years' time, they'll be doing exactly the same as they're doing today. Whereas what we were doing, in the last 2 million years has been interesting. And of course, that begs the question, what's going to come next?
It's just interesting listening to this, that we don't like, and rightly so, we don't like teleology in science. So we don't want to attribute teleology in the evolutionary process. However, it seems like the evolutionary process has created intensely teleological people. In other words, as humans, it's all about purpose, right? It's all about seeing how something could be useful, that it could lead in a direction. We look at history as having purpose. Like we're very teleological creatures. And I just find it very interesting, almost maybe paradoxical, that we came about through a non-teleological process. But in fact, in other words, we become kind of like the captains of evolution. Like we're going to now take evolution from a non-teleological thing, and we're going to take control of it. And
yes, no, I understand. And I and many other people I've came across, somebody else was saying very similar things. A chap called Owen Barfield is that, what we've managed to do is become self-aware. And by becoming self-aware, the universe has become self-aware.
Yeah.
And in that sense, and indeed, it's perfectly respectable to have a philosophy or religion which identifies a telos. And the fact that that is something which only the humans can do, I could find entirely consistent. I'm quite relaxed about that. But I wouldn't want to ram this down anybody else's throat, sort of say, you've got to believe in this because this particular scientist suggests that,
right.
Because the science is always, in that sense, is tentative. But no, that's absolutely correct. Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen, we've gone way over time. Dr. Conway Morris, is there any final words or any kind of a summary, anything you'd like to say, or do you want to tell us about some future projects that we can look forward to?
Oh, well, thank you. No, I'm reading widely at the moment. I'm reading Ian McGilchrist's Ambassador and Emissary. I'm reading a lot of Owen Barfield. We won't unpack any of these sorts of things. I'm trying to read some Whitehurst. What else am I reading? I'm reading a great deal of stuff written by the Inklings, including Barfield. I mean, all one can say is that I don't have a mobile phone and I do a lot of reading. How's that?
The point being, you're reading all these things, but you don't know what you're going to write about them.
Not at the moment. I have a few ideas, but It's work in progress.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, we do look forward to it. You've got an immense amount of information and ideas in that head, very provocative ideas, and we really appreciate you sharing them with us.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, nice to talk. Okay.
We will talk again.
Take care of yourselves.
Take care.
Okay, cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts. or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.